Welcome to episode 2 of the Expert Cruise Show. I'm Anthony, he's Chris. Between us, we try and share our love of cruise ships and ocean liners and the booking process and having the best vacation at sea. Because, you know, have you been on land recently? It's not a place I particularly want to be. So let's head out to sea for as much of the year as we possibly can.
It doesn't surprise me at all, Anthony, that cruise lines are reporting record bookings at the moment. Honestly, I think people, either for the first time or those who haven't been for a while, are re-engaging with the love of the sea just to get away from having that 24-hour news cycle down their throat all the time, probably more than anything else.
So maybe you could explain to us, as a maritime historian, obviously you kind of really keep an eye on this stuff, that during the pandemic, when all the cruise ships were laid up, and obviously they were losing money every single day, and they had a kind of skeleton crew on them, but they were anchored off, various places, and it was a very weird time. And in fact, a few ships that had just been built, including a couple of Edge-class ships, they never got used for the first 2 years. That they're just like sitting around, which I thought was interesting, because you go on a ship and you look it up and you're like, oh, this ship is 4 years old. Yeah, but it's only had 1 year's worth of use.
Yes.
Isn't that kind of interesting, isn't it?
It's so different. Like, it's a very different period, because even in past pandemics and past conflicts that have caused disruption to passenger shipping. So you think about, the Spanish flu pandemic, for example, or the World War I and World War II uses of passenger ships. They weren't laid up the way they were during COVID. They were still the only way to transport people around the world. So they were used as either troop transports, and even during sort of medical crises in the past, people sort of took that risk to travel. They didn't shut the whole world down like they did for COVID. So we had the situation where approximately 300 or so cruise ships, and of course the three at the time ocean liners that were still in service, they were basically laid up in a state that's kind of referred to as warm layup, because no one knew when the pandemic was going to become manageable. No one knew when cruising would resume. So the expense of actually shutting a ship down and mothballing it was so high that basically all the cruise lines opted to do this warm layup. So, as you say, skeleton crews on board. They were anchored, but they still had to move because they had to do their discharges of water. So you'd watch the voyage cruise maps and stuff and see all these ships kind of doing this little dance around between the different anchorage locations, because they had to share what was a very limited amount of space. I think the most perhaps the best illustration, because of course there was some Edge-class ships, Celebrity Edge, for example, that was laid up quite new into its career. But Virgin Voyages was probably the best example, because they just launched. They'd done a media cruise in the UK. They sent Scarlet Lady across to the US for its inaugural season, and immediately had to go into shutdown. And she ended up spending some time in waters off the US, and then went back to the shipyard in Europe to ride out the pandemic. And for a new start, brand new cruise line, that's pretty big risk to have your whole business shut down before you even got started.
And as I say, I haven't yet been on Virgin Voyages, but I really like the fact that they treat their crew so well. This is what we're starting to hear from the crews, is that they, they're having a much better experience on board. I think about the crews all the time on these ships, and I always try hard to kind of tip people in cash in addition to paying the daily gratuities. But Virgin, apparently, the crew don't have to pay extra for Wi-Fi or for water, whereas on Royal Caribbean they're literally having to buy water. I mean, it's heavily subsidized, but it's not included in what they do. And then the same with Wi-Fi. It's always important.
Actually,
go ahead.
It's funny because as a guest speaker, I do lectures on cruise ships, and Cunard, for example, which is the one I've worked with the most, they put you up in a passenger cabin in passenger accommodation. But some of the other cruise lines that I've done work for, it's like hit and miss as to what kind of accommodation you're going to get. Sometimes you get passenger rooms, but if the ship is full, you get what they consider to be sort of an entertainer or an ENTS cabin, or ED cabin, entertainment department, and these ones can sometimes be in the crew areas, and they're kind of dressed up to look like passenger cabins, but they're not the same kind of quality. And on this one particular voyage, it was actually on board a P&O Cruises UK ship. We were berthed in one of these rooms, and of course it's surrounded by other entertainment cabins, but there's also crew areas. But you go outside of the passenger area into the crew only part of the ship and start walking down the main corridors and seeing sort of the crew amenities to get to your room. And this particular one, it wasn't right next to, but it was several doors up from this very ominous looking door that had mortuary written on it. And like the world behind the scenes is very much different to what the passengers see on a daily basis. And of course, that room itself, it had twin portholes. It had the deadlights on the portholes because it was quite low down in the ship. It was bunks. Now, I'm almost 2 meters tall. The bunks were interesting to try and get in and out of. And just outside it, there was sort of a staging area where they would bring in equipment from when they were boarding stores and stuff. So we get there and there's all these big like pallets set up, and it smelt like a little bit like some sort of detergent smell that was running through the area, and very, very different from that beautifully decorated passenger area. But of course, the crew on so many of these ships have been used to that for so long.
Right.
Then you look at what Virgin's doing, and they're actually putting some decoration into the crew areas. Yeah. It is quite a difference.
And they're also giving single cabins to crew as well. There's less sharing going on. And what they have a kind of clever system, and this is also on the Icon class now, is they have a shared bathroom between two single cabins. So the bathroom has Jack and Jill doors, and as long as you have an agreement with the person that you're sharing the bathroom with as to who's going to use it and when, and obviously you can lock it from the inside. But that's a much better way of doing it, to give some privacy to people. And so I think about the crew all the time. And also my mum used to work as crew on board the ship selling jewellery, and she did it for 10 years. And so I got all the intel on, she started off getting crew cabins, and and she's older and her husband's older, and so they sometimes struggled in crew accommodation, and eventually they started to get passenger cabins as well. But that's a whole subject that we're going to keep coming back to these things during the episodes of the Expert Crew Show, because these are the types of stories that I think give you a greater empathy for the people who are serving you on board. And it's a tough life. You don't get a day off. Occasionally, if you're lucky, you'll get but they all work 7 days a week. They might get a few hours in port, but there's no days off, and that's tough. That really is. So we'll kind of come to that. I wanted to mention just quickly, only because you mentioned smell, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this. Is it just me being overly sensitive? I mean, I do have quite a big nose, but whenever I get on board, and we love that moment of the fight. Cruise day is obviously very exciting, and when you crisscross the jet bridge to kind of get to the ship. So exciting, and if you get someone slow in front of you, there's nothing worse than having to come on, let's just get on board, And then when you finally step on, and normally you walk onto the promenade deck or a little bit of the outside before you go inside. Obviously all ships are different, but whenever I get in, I suddenly remember the thing that I always forget about going on cruises, and that is there's quite a pungent smell on board. And obviously some of the older ships are worse than the newer ships, but there is a distinct, it's like sewage mixed with disinfectant, mixed with like vomit in a bag. I'm not sure what it actually is. Do you have any insight as to what that smell is?
Well, I mean, I think if you're boarding through the promenade deck area, as you make your way sort of from the gangway to the promenade deck and then into the ship, there's quite often on the top deck areas, there's like ventilation that's bringing smells from inside the ship up out. Right. And so it depends really on the ship, but many of them also have on the promenade deck, they have a drainage system as well that can sort of pull some of that. So I guess if it's not raining and water's not going down the drainage system, it can pull some of that smell out. But it depends on the ship, I suppose. Like I remember, and anyone who's been on board, you will remember this too. Anyone who's been on board the old QE2, it wasn't a nasty sewage smell when you boarded the ship, but it was a very distinctive smell of sort of like almost furniture upholstery with
rotting
wood.
flesh.
No, not QE2. She had a good one, but there were other areas on the ship that had this sort of the smell that you described, particularly down in the lower decks, where there were actually, the way that ship was designed with the plumbing wasn't vacuum flush, so there was actually drains throughout, obviously, as part of the plumbing system, and you kind of get that whiff of shipboard smell. But I think a lot of work is done now to try and reduce the amount of impact that has. They quite often on the newer builds have these sort of ventilation areas clustered in certain parts of the ship and away from the embarkation experience, because of course, when you're boarding what is effectively a floating luxury hotel, you want it to be a good experience from the very beginning. But if you're experiencing many cruises where it's a deep sewage smell, probably it's a good idea or a good thing that you don't remember that until you're boarding, because it might put you off.
Could we talk for a second about the idea of luxury? Because now we are both huge advocates for cruising, and we love it. And I'll cruise on any ship. Like I'm not even fussed. Like if it's a choice between no ship and a miserable ship, I'll still do it. I love it. Yeah. I haven't quite gone to kind of Margaritaville levels yet. I'm aware that ship is around, and weirdly, there's some YouTubers have posted videos of like the worst reviewed ship ever, and they've all gone on it and had quite a good time. And actually,
and there's actually two of them now, right. So like they must be doing something right.
So I'll take any ship, but this is the interesting thing, is that because I grew up in London and I worked in hospitality, and I worked at the Savoy, and I worked at Claridge's, and I worked at the Dorchester, and I worked at all of these places that kind of instigated silver service. And they also started the butler service. And so so when you get a butler, I think is it Emirates that does it? When you get a butler in first class on Emirates, they say, they've been trained by the Savoy. If you were to book, say, the Retreat on Celebrity Cruises and you get a butler, I doubt very much that butler has been trained by the Savoy. And this goes back...
It's a different product.
Different product. And this goes back to what we were saying in the first episode last week about how the Cunard waiting staff doing White Star service are not getting the kind of training that was typical decades ago, and that standards have slipped. But I believe it's because customers are less discerning, and because, the average person isn't going to Claridge's. I mean, I would never go to those places as a customer. I was there because I worked. Occasionally, maybe I used to get like a coupon for a 3-course meal at the Savoy for £35 that included a glass of champagne, and I'd spend all day there for that. But the quality of service, the ability to just kind of look up and know that there are waiting staff who are looking at you all the time. Waiting, exactly as you described. So that you don't have to kind of do the wave, which my parents do in such an embarrassing fashion, or the signing the check in the air. Can we get the check, please? You shouldn't have to do any of that stuff. You should just be able to just do that. And the communication line is so nuanced and so bespoke. So that all I'm saying is, I'm just drawing a comparison, that is it worth paying the extra for things like the Retreat and the ship within a ship concept, when even though they call it a butler, and I have friends who have done that, and they've done it on Celebrity and they've done it on Cunard, and they say, we didn't really know what our butler was there for. Like, we didn't really have anything for him to do. It was kind of embarrassing. We had to go looking for a pair of shoes to give him to go shine. And also, I don't know about you, but I personally would be very embarrassed to have somebody that was called a butler around. Socially, I just feel that those days, the days of servitude in that way, should be confined to the past. And so the only reason I'm saying this is because that high standard of service, silver service, both in the dining room and just generally, are really only available if you're paying $500, $600, $700 a night at these London hotels. And I'm sure New York has an equivalent, Paris has an equivalent. But what's the point in having the fake version on the ships? Like, is it worth paying for the fake version?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you be better off just
really
going to London for a vacation and getting the real deal?
I think that's a really interesting point, because one of the delightful things about cruising, particularly from the 80s and 90s and even into the early 2000s, was that regardless of many brands, regardless of what category you were in, there was a minimum service level that you would receive in the dining rooms. Now, if you think about some of the finer brands through that period, through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, like when I first started traveling on cruise ships, even in the standard dining room on a luxury brand company that says it's a luxury brand, you would get in the lowest of the tier of the dining rooms, you would get 2 wait staff at your table. You would have, obviously it was set seating, so they knew who you were from the start, and they got to know you, they got to know your likes. We would walk in, one of my sister has knife and fork the opposite way around to how it's usually laid out. We would walk in, her place was set from day 2. They knew your dietary requirements from day 2 because you told them on day 1. There was sommelier walking around who would actually do the tastings with you. Like, they had the little thing around their neck. I don't even know what it's called, but they would do that whole setup, and they were trained as sommelier. The maitre d' would get to know you at the entrance. There was assistant waiters who would come around and learn the tables in their area and start to interact with the passengers, and the whole thing was a spectacle. So it was this remarkable experience of, once you went into the dining room, you were going into this special world where it was that kind of level of service that really couldn't be found easily at that price point anywhere else. So you could get it at these luxury hotels, but for $100 a day in an inside cabin, you wouldn't get that sort of service. Now, I've really noticed that since, well, I guess for the last 10 years or so, but particularly post-pandemic, a lot of that has been dumbed down, and this move to having any freestyle dining, which is wonderful in some respects, don't get me wrong, but when you have these grand multi-story dining rooms on these cruise ships that were designed for everyone to come together and have an atmosphere that's just electric, and then you change it to this, like, come and go wherever you want, upper level's different to lower level. I noticed on the open dining, the staff are stressed. The wait staff don't know who they're serving. You have to explain your dietary requirements each time.
That's right. And they throw the food at you because they're so busy. They can't.
The next people are waiting. They've got a buzzer waiting for the buzzer to go off.
My Cunard waiter, he said, and I only just remembered this, and I'm not interrupting you longer than to say this sentence. He said, I used to have 7 tables. Now I have 10 tables.
Yes. So I don't know if... And I think that's, what's interesting is, I know we're going to talk about celebrity a bit today, but I was just so amazed on Celebrity when I was on board Celebrity Edge. And sure, I was on board as a guest of media, but the service on the ship, they realized, I think, with this next class, this next generation, that we're not doing the big dining room experience anymore. So they took what would be the main dining room and turned it into multiple smaller dining rooms, which means that when you go into that space, it seems smaller, it seems more intimate, it seems like it's all slowed down a little bit. And you can forgive the fact that the person there doesn't know who you are, because this is your first time in that venue. Right. So it becomes very clever, like a totally different... It is. Yeah. It's very clever. Whereas I think many repeat travelers, and I know, P&O UK does it, where they have the set seating dining room, and they have the second one is quite often the open seating dining room. And many of the brands that have like Cunard, as you say, that have had that traditional big dining room experience, Holland America, a few others, I think many of the repeat guests remember the quality of the service and the attentiveness of the service, and then they kind of lament the loss of that, while still wanting to do the open dining because I can go whenever I feel like it. The two things aren't really compatible.
Well, they're kind of trading on past glory in a way, aren't they? And so I think a lot of it is projection, because you get back what you give, right? So As a passenger, not a guest, because otherwise it would be free, if you are attentive with your waiting staff, and if you learn their names, and if you ask them where they're from, and you give them the time of day, you are going to get a 100% better experience. And that
absolutely,
and that is, I mean, I'm not trying to teach grandma to suck eggs. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but a lot of people have never been to formal dining before. Certainly here in the US, there aren't formal dining venues anywhere in many of these towns and places where people have saved up to go on a cruise. So for them, having a butler, potentially, ship within a ship, they're never going to get to Claridge's or the Savoy or the Dorchester. This is as close as they will ever come, and because they don't have the experience, they've been used to going to the Cheesecake Factory, this is a very special thing. And I sometimes think those are often the people that do start bossing people around, and they don't learn the names, and they don't know that the nuance goes both ways. I want to say something about the Celebrity Edge class dining rooms, which is very clever. So we've got Normandy, Cosmopolitan, Tuscan, and anyone?
Oh,
anyone?
Oh, you got me.
Did I say Cosmopolitan?
Cyprus.
There it is.
There we go. It was there somewhere.
And obviously Cyprus, because Celebrity was a Greek line originally, and they wanted to bring a kind of Mediterranean theme into one. Now, you get the standard menu in all four, but you also get some rotating specific dishes. But here's what's so clever about these four dining rooms. Now, they're all at the back of the ship, and they all, deck 3 and deck 4, and they all have these separate menus, but they also all connect to the same galley. So they don't have four separate kitchens. It's one kitchen serving the main dining room as if it was one big room. And it is one big room. It's just on, 2 levels, effectively. You've got 2 restaurants up there and 2 down there. And so this is the genius of the design, is that it only looks like, it's like a magic trick, right? It's deceiving. You feel like you're going into separate dining rooms because there's a staircase separating them on each level, and they're in opposite directions, but you're basically just going into one big main dining room. And here's the tip. If you're in Normandy and you want something on the Cosmopolitan menu and you remember from last night, ask them and they'll bring it to you.
Yeah.
Because it's all coming out the same galley.
But the fact that they have the 4 themes and then they take that the standard menu, they take that and then they customize it for each room, it feels from a passenger's perspective like it's something different.
I
it's
loved
special.
it. And you know something?
So clever.
I thought I was going to like Normandy best because, of course, the ocean liner Normandy, the French ship, super luxurious ship. So I was like, that's going to be my restaurant. But I tried them all. And actually, the one that I didn't sign up for more than once on a 7-day voyage, I saved to the end, was Tuscan. Because I didn't really like the black and white design, which they're kind of going for Italian fashion, I discovered recently. Sure, but the food in there was the best food of all the 4 restaurants. The pastas were so fresh. It was so delicious. And so what I do now is I pre-book. As you know, I'm going on the Edge soon. So as soon as I book, I jump on the app and I book my dining times, because for me, like 5:30 is too early and 8:30 is too late. So I book 7 p.m. or 7:15 every night, and I rotate the restaurants like this so that I've got a pre-booking. And because I like to book ships quite far out, every time slot that I want is available.
It's a very clever setup. I think the other thing about the whole Edge class that I found so interesting is that when you go into the alfresco restaurant, the buffet restaurant,
the Ocean View Cafe. I mean, let's give it its proper title. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it properly.
Thank you. Thank you. Hold me to account. It's the way that they brought the food out in those sort of almost like serving dishes. They're kind of like massive skillets almost. They place them around, and then they have this rotations thing happening so that they're always monitoring how it's going, bringing out fresh stuff as the quantity decreases. So you walk in there and it doesn't feel like you're kind of going through, being herded through like cattle and trying to like work out which one it is, and then, this one's only got 3 bits left, so I'm going to go to the next one. It's a sort of magical display where you're kind of meandering your way around, but if it's getting low, it's been replaced and topped up before it gets to the point where it looks like you're getting, the scraps. Yeah. It was such a clever setup.
They don't do that on Margaritaville.
No, I don't suppose so. Or any of the, like, to be
Well,
fair,
even on Cunard, they don't do that.
No. And actually, the funny thing is, and I was really surprised by this. Now, this brand doesn't exist anymore, but P&O Cruises in Australia was very different to P&O Cruises UK. So it was a sort of a middle of the market, very very affordable, very cheerful.
I'm so sorry that you get the worst ships. You seem to get the dregs of the fleet in Australia, don't you?
It's been since there was a newspaper report back in the 1800s from the newspaper in Australia called the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was talking about the new Orient Line ship that was being brought here, which was a rival to P&O, and they were so sick of the oldest ships being sent to Australia that in this old newspaper report it said even the great Peninsula and Oriental doesn't see fit to bring its best boats to Australia. So it's been 200 years in the making.
It's been a thing, yeah. Why break the habit?
You know what was really interesting though, Anthony, is that some of the absolute best dining experiences that I've had, and look, I've travelled on a number of different brands and many luxury brands, was on P&O Cruises Australia. They had done sort of what they did on Celebrity. They retrofitted these ships where they have the three, because they're all princess ships that they had, and they had the two main dining rooms, one on top of the other. And they took the bottom one and they kept that one as like a dining room, and they themed it as the waterfront. You were going to say
they took the bottom one and they put it on the top, and they took the top one and they put it on the bottom.
No, not quite that basic. But the top one, they split into two dining rooms. They had Angelo's, which was your Italian fare, and they had Dragon Lady, which was Asian-inspired, all sharing the same galley. But it was all included, and the quality of the food was so good. But the other thing was, the staff, it wasn't silver service. It never wanted to try and be silver service. But they had staffed it well enough that you felt like it was personalised. And I think that's the big thing, is that they had the note on your, like when you checked in, that you knew which cabin you were, they knew your dietary requirements, so you didn't have to repeat yourself every time. And then it just kind of flowed so well. And that's something that all the cruise lines could very easily do. Look, if P&O Cruises Australia could do it, anyone can do it,
Well, it's just training. It doesn't really require much more than that. The only issue, I think, is if they're reducing staff numbers or they're giving staff multiple jobs, which is the case now. So whereas Royal Caribbean have stopped doing the nightly turn-down service, or they're giving you a choice. When you first show up, they say to you, do you want to have your cabin done in the morning or do you want to have it done in the evening, which is kind of interesting. And I actually think personally works better. I don't think we need to have it done twice a day, but it's really nice when they do. And so, and when, the times that I'm in and out the cabin is so weird. And so sometimes I'd be in the cabin for, because I'm working often on these ships. So I just don't leave the cabin until noon. And so, but he'd still come in and do it.
Yeah, and you do feel a bit like, quite often because I do the lectures.
I feel a bit bad. I'd be like, are you literally waiting for me? Like hiding in your cupboard, like waiting, like, has he gone yet?
I quite often say, like on the ones where it is twice a day is the standard, I'll quite often say in the mornings, like, don't worry about it today because I'm going to get breakfast. I'm coming back to get ready for the talk, which is fine. But, speaking of food, the one brand that I thought just knows how to do a buffet, and that was Royal Caribbean. When I sailed on Royal Caribbean in the Windjammer Cafe, going to use the proper name.
Washy.
It was just remarkable the way that they have the setup done in such a, because so many times I think the attempt to stylize the appearance of the ship's buffet restaurant gets in the way of how people actually behave in a situation like that. So when you have these ones where they got multiple lines that go through but multiple stations and people going like this all over the place, it's just chaos. It's utter chaos. Whereas on the Royal Caribbean ships that I've sailed on, particularly I remember Enchantment of the Seas, a Vision class ship, you had one entry on both sides. It fed you into the buffet area, and you didn't have to double back on yourself for anything. So it was set up in such a way that
it was replicated.
It was replicated, exactly. And the funniest thing, Anthony, this was just so funny. One morning we woke up, it was rather late, so we were having a late breakfast. And we'd gone through and got our breakfast, but one side of it had been sort of shut down for them to do the preparation for lunch. And we'd gone through and done our, got our food, and we sat down quite close to the buffet, and we were just kind of watching what was going on. And they had these people that were coming through, and they'd started putting the breakfast food on their plate. And as they were getting around sort of the central area at the front, the little rope had been moved and the lunch service had opened, and they just kept following it around and started with putting the lunch stuff on their plate as well. So it was just so well funneled that they hadn't even clicked, hang on, I've got breakfast and lunch at the same time. What am I doing? Because the design had been done in such a way that it made people it stopped the confusion and stopped the doubling back. So it wasn't like you're bumping into everyone all the time. It was just really well designed from a human movement point of view.
It's so hard, isn't it? Because, I always recommend people to try and take all their meals in the main dining room, only because if you're going on vacation, you don't want to fight with strangers over food and get their germs, because half of them don't wash their hands when they come in anyway. I'm always watching. I know if you haven't washed your hands.
Oh, I know.
I'm always looking.
Some people.
And so,
hey, but do you find though that the food in the particularly there's some meals that I totally agree.
Yeah.
Right. But there's some types of food on some cruise lines where I don't think they know how to do it to save their lives. Like there are some cruise lines out there in the main dining room, they could not poach an egg or scramble an egg if it was the last thing they had to do. Honestly. But the buffet, you can ask them to do it fresh in front of you. You can literally go up to the egg station and say, "Can you make me an egg?"
Conceptually, and everyone is different. But I would rather have an egg that was slightly overcooked that I send back and be seated at a table with a white tablecloth and a view, and it be gentle, than start, the vultures, watching the vultures. That's what I call them. Weirdly, when I first went on Queen Mary 2 doing the maiden voyage back in 2004, was the first kind of experience of the King's Court, and that is it's a beautiful. It's obviously been renovated a few times since, but it's a beautiful buffet. But we still referred to it as Debenhams, which is the name of a kind of historic department store in England, because they always had a restaurant, and it always reminded me of the buffet in Debenhams for some reason. So I'd say to my friends, "Oh, are you going to go to Debenhams for lunch?" And the thing is, if you're going for a luxury experience, no matter what line, I understand that different personality types will naturally gravitate towards the different restaurants, and some people like to go and get the Mexican food by the pool on Royal Caribbean, at the Lime and Coconut, and other people will literally want to take lunch in the Corinthia Lounge. So there are options. I should say that being on the Queen Anne maiden voyage in January and seeing a protected buffet for the first time where they serve you, and that was very interesting, and I didn't have a problem with that at all.
I liked it.
I put up with the fact that they were feeding me less and potentially doing a little portion control. I'm sure there was some training there. In return,
but you didn't have anyone sneezing on it, did you?
Exactly, you didn't have anyone sneeze. So it was like. And also, I wasn't putting on so many calories. So, there were more pros than cons. But it was interesting seeing it done in that way. And obviously, that ship was designed during the pandemic, and therefore it was a no-brainer. They had to do, do away with self-service. But I would like to think that it would be better if more lines, because I keep reading about ships that have norovirus outbreaks, and I'm just like. It's that damn buffet, I'm telling you. It really is.
Yeah. Actually, norovirus is really interesting as well, because if you look at the statistics, because the cruise industry has to report every norovirus outbreak, it's a regulation, you get this sort of disproportionate level of reporting from cruising, but land-based establishments in many parts of the world don't have to mandatorily report.
So it just seems like it's probably worse.
Well, it's probably something that is common across all environments like that, buffet environments. I imagine airlines, you get off the plane and 2 days later you're sick. Yeah. You don't necessarily think, oh, it's the plane. The airport lounges where there's those buffet helpings, it isn't overly sanitary in terms of its offering.
I would never eat in those places. I mean, it's so important that we take responsibility for ourselves. And anywhere where it's like, oh, there's free food, invariably there's also free norovirus. Right? or
complimentary,
or salmonella or something that they're throwing into the equation. So I'm very much of the opinion that you need to take responsibility for your own sanitary behavior and hope that others do it too. And I carry hand gel around, and I'm like, my hands are so dry at the end of a cruise. But this is.
I actually quite like how some of the cruise lines now, and particularly on the newer ships, are building in the hand washing stations with the water.
Yes.
Now, I know I mean, you just watch people. They basically push past the person who's standing there trying to police this thing. But I like that because the hand sanitizer can make it very, very dry, as you say. So having a few different options, there's no excuse not to. I really don't understand.
And also, there's nothing better than a 20-second hand wash with soap and water. It's still the best way to get your hands clean. And also, like, sometimes if you're eating food like a pizza with your hand, you take a mouthful and it tastes of hand sanitizer, and you're like, where did that come from? And then you realise that just 5 minutes earlier you were squirting and wiping, you know. But maybe we should... Actually,
it's funny you were saying about the name of the buffet, because I've actually got some friends here who are on the cruises quite often when I'm on board, and they refer to it as the trough.
Right.
And so it's like this little thing. We'll go down the trough.
We got the trough. We got the Ocean View Cafe. I have to say, one of the best buffets, because I love the Indian food mainly, and because there's so many crew from Southeast Asia, there are so many people who know how to make a curry that they just let them get on with it. And in fact, I was on... What ship was I on? Maybe it was the Norwegian Bliss, but I met the head chef and he was Indian, and I was like, that's why the Indian food is so good on this ship. Yeah. Because literally, like, their soul is in it, and they're using their grandparents' recipes. And I had a great chat with this guy, and I really do feel like, you know, we have to recognize that a ship is only as good as its head chef when it comes to food. And so even though they're working from the same inventory and the same budget, a good executive chef can really make the experience very positive, but a bad executive chef is going to potentially drop the ball. So, but Norwegian, they do a great buffet. You know, I found their main dining room was not as good, but the buffet was much stronger, whereas Cunard was the other way around. The main dining room was much better than the what do they call it on Queen Anne? Hasn't it got a fancy name? The buffet? The Artisan Food Hall.
Artisan's Food Hall,
ridiculous.
Yes. But I do like in Artisans on Queen Anne, for breakfast, they do have a barista station there, which is such an improvement. Right. Because I'm not a huge fan. Many others I know aren't a huge fan of the...
Well, Celebrity does that too, because they have a small version of Cafe El Baccio by the buffet on the Edge class ships as well. So they have baristas making proper coffees there too. Some people are obsessed with coffee. I mean, this is the other thing, is like, you know, getting the drinks package and all that stuff. And as you know, I don't like to spend a dime more than I prepaid for the cruise. Like if I'm getting a cruise for $2,000 for two people, then $2,000 is what I'm paying. The only addition will be the daily gratuities. But I don't spend. I remember I took my kids on the Navigator of the Seas the first time, and I looked at my end of my bill for the end of the cruise, and the only additional charge was for a cake pop from the onboard Starbucks, which was about $2.50 each. So I spent $5. Dad, can we have a cake pop? Can we have a cake pop? Because they had experience of getting those from Starbucks anyway. And I just think going to a Starbucks on a cruise is sacrilege. Like, do not do that. It really is the wrong thing to do. And as I don't know if we gave this tip last week, but if you're on a celebrity cruise, if you go to the Spa Cafe, they have a proper coffee machine there. You can get a free coffee that's like a really good coffee. It's not just drip. It's like a proper machine. And if you're clever, I think Cunard does this too. If you know where to go on the ship, you mentioned Queen Mary 2 and down in the Connections area last week, I think. But there is always a decent free coffee machine somewhere, and you just need to find it.
You know, one of the things I recently spent some time on board Boletta from Fred Olsen Cruises. Yeah. And they had this lovely sort of setup where they had a sort of central cafe area with its own lounge and seating area, but on the other side they had a tea room, and the Oriental tea room is what it was called. And you're in there and it's sort of set up to do the traditional tea, and they gave us, it was a tour, like a walk through the ship, and they gave us the experience with this little tray of cakes and stuff. But I'm not a huge tea drinker, so I asked if I could get the coffee, and of course, because it's just across there, it's proper barista coffee. I don't know if they were using different, because quite often the coffee is ruined on cruise ships by the UHT or the long life milk, But this one seemed to have, like, maybe they'd just taken fresh stores in the Australian port that we were in. But they were able to bring it across. It was fresh, it was warm, so the whole selection was available there. And I know some people take breakfast in their cabins. We actually had a wonderful experience. It was a very different experience on Princess cruises, where they do a breakfast on the balcony sort of experience, where they bring the food to you.
But only if you've got a balcony.
Only if you've got a balcony, and also it's an extra. It is an extra charge. Yeah. But you know what was funny is that we're sailing from Sydney down to Hobart in Tasmania, so we're going through the Bass Strait, and it's rough as guts. The wind is blowing. They said to us, like, do you want to not do this? But we thought, we're only on board for 3 nights, so let's give it a try. So we're sitting out there with our jumpers on and all like rugged up with our little tray of food, trying to enjoy our breakfast on the balcony. But I do think the big stand in there is the crew experience. And like, obviously in the buffet back in the day in the 90s, if you were having trouble with your tray or your plate, they don't do trays anymore, but if you had trouble with your tray, there'd be someone there available to help take it to the seat for you. There was much more attentive service, and now it's almost a little bit like there's a slightly a larger reliance on DIY when it comes to cruising, just like there was, you go to the supermarket, they expect you to scan your own groceries now. I know I was amazed to see in the buffet area on board Aurora some years ago, P&O Cruises ship, that there's a DIY wine serving station. Right. So you press the button of the one you want and you scan your card and you put your glass under and it fills it up for you. I mean, that is worlds apart.
Yeah, they have that on Celebrity too, and I think it's for people who have the drinks package, and it saves them having to kind of waste time finding a wine server. But
yeah, but isn't that part of the experience?
Well, but this is what we keep coming back to, isn't it? The diminishing experience over time. Now, we're not being ungrateful, because I will go on any cruise, as you know, and I also am not a burden on the crew. Like, I don't have no reason to go to the purser's office or customer guest services. I just don't go there. I always see a long line, and I'm like, maybe it's because I spend so much time mitigating every problem before I actually get on the ship. I spend so much time on the phone with them and, measuring the distances between the TV. Like when I went on Queen Anne, I was worried that the TV wasn't going to swivel, because I'd read that the TVs were fixed, and I knew that in my unusual cabin that we talked about last week, the TV didn't face the bed. And I was like, how are we going to watch the TV? And so I then read that they were starting to retrofit some of the TVs with hinge brackets, right? So that you could actually do it. Yeah. First thing I did when I get on board Queen Anne was pull the TV to see if it came off on my hands or whether it swiveled, and it swiveled. And I could see on the back of the wall the old bracket that they'd kind of filled in, and the new bracket. Yes. And so I just love this kind of stuff. But my point is that preparation is everything, and there is so much information out there. Last week I mentioned cruisedeckplans.com, this cross-referencing site. There is so much data that prevents you from having a disaster. Now, some people don't want to do that work. There's also Cruise Critic and any of these kind of, threads where people are, even TripAdvisor, I think, has information, as well as hopefully your comments down below this video, because I'm very keen for people to start having their own threads and conversations about some of these things. But I'm keen to hear whether or not people are in the breakfast in the dining room or breakfast in the buffet. I wanted to follow on from that. So on Cunard, room service is free. So you don't pay a $10 or $12. Yes. Do you know something that I don't know? Well, have you not noticed on Queen Anne, they now have the free room service and an increasing list of paid room service. Yes. That was never the way in the past. But I don't know. They did that in the Golden Lion pub as well. It's like you can have... on Queen Anne. Yeah. On Queen Anne, if you want to have a burger, you've got to have the John Turode burger, and that's going to cost you $12. It's ridiculous. Yeah. But that's not the point that I'm making. The point I'm making is that if you can get a free continental breakfast in your room, which most lines still do, right? Yes. Then you've got to do it anyway and make it your first of 2 breakfasts. Right? That is how it's done. Like, if you want to take full advantage... You're the Hobbit. Right, well, why not? So they send you Danish pastries, they'll send you toast, they'll send you cereal, they'll send you yogurt, they'll send you tea and coffee, they'll send you smoothies, fresh fruit, and none of that costs any money. Well, that's a whole breakfast. So
yeah, this is the reason why you need to use the gym, though.
well, that's a whole other story. But thank goodness this show is from the chest up.
I know.
But I also, because I only started kind of getting into this stuff relatively recently, the idea of doing 2 breakfasts and 2 dinners. Because I would talk to people in the main dining room and I'd be like, how's your food? And they'd be like, yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't matter because we're going to go to the buffet later anyway. And I'd be like, what, for a midnight snack? And they're like, no, for dinner, after dinner. And this is what people are doing. They are not just ordering double starter and double main course in the main dining room, but they're going upstairs and seeing if there's anything that takes their fancy and grazing after dinner. So my recommendation is, if room service is chargeable and you don't want to pay, get the continental breakfast, have it delivered to your room at a time when you're still chilling out in bed. You don't have to get up yet. You have a nice coffee in bed. There's nothing better than, because to me, that's the difference between being on a cruise vacation versus being at home, or being on a cruise vacation versus staying in a not very good hotel on land where this service is not offered, right?
Yeah.
If the service is there, take advantage of it, allow yourself to be pampered, and there's no extra charge, and have a Danish pastry and a cup of coffee, and then take a leisurely shower and leisurely stroll to breakfast in either the buffet or the MDR.
Yeah. You know what's interesting as well is that we touched on it earlier, but the ship within a ship concept,
right,
which is the
ship within a ship is the one that I'm interested in.
Well, you know what, I think it's interesting because it's the marketer's take on first, second, and third class. Because if you look back to the past, we had 3 classes basically on most ships. There were some shipping lines that had 4, but for all intents and purposes, there was first, second cabin, and third or steerage, and that became tourist class. And then in the 60s and 70s, when cruising was starting to evolve with smaller ships and they were trying to get more people on, yes, of course there was differences in your cabin category. There may have been differences in which dining room you were assigned to, but the thing they used to advertise is that the ship is available for everybody. You can enjoy all the amenities and all the facilities. Now we're in this situation where, particularly on legacy lines, and all these lines have been around for that period of time, they're taking parts of what was the main product and they're putting them behind a door and telling everybody, oh, look, it's all good. But actually, in some respects, it's not, because why should there be a special section where you've paid to be on board, but now you have to pay extra to get access to that sort of stuff? Now, I'm not saying like 1 or 2 spaces, or that if there was an adults only retreat, or if there's a special lounge for the dining room that is specifically for the top suites, that's one thing. But this whole like more and more of the ship being divided is literally going back to the days of Titanic.
It is very interesting, but I have a positive spin on this.
Okay.
Now, whenever you search for a cruise, as I said last week, search price low to high. So start with the cheapest sailings, and you and I we discuss the transatlantic crossing all the time because it's so historic and it's our favourite, and Queen Mary 2 is the only one that does a scheduled service. And I mentioned last week that years ago I used to pay $599 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And that would include a return flight. So you had 7 days at sea. Or back then it was 5 and 6 days. They used to go faster because they, fuel wasn't so expensive. Now they go a bit slower and save on fuel. But it included a return flight. And I was like, you couldn't book a flight for that. Do you know what I mean? No. Even in economy.
Yeah.
And you're getting a first class experience even in steerage. So if we use Cunard as the example, if you pay the least, and I wanted to mention that I just got an alert from cruiseline.com, which I have the alert set up on, and it showed me that the Atlantic crossing for, what was the date? I sent it to you. It was around
December, wasn't it?
Maybe it was July.
Okay.
2025.
Yeah, you sent me a few this morning,
right.
Actually.
And it was, but what was the price? It was it $5 or
$5.99?
No, it was $5.69.
$5.69.
It was $569 per person
US dollars
for a 7-day transatlantic crossing on the greatest ocean liner ever built in total luxury. Now, admittedly, it was for an inside cabin, but that doesn't matter. And here's why.
No.
Because you're in Britannia class, and I know you know what I'm about to say, and I know that you are excited about the fact that what I'm about to say tallies with what you think. Why would you want to be in a tiny little dining room in the Princess or the Queen's Grill or the Retreat?
Yes.
Or the ship within a ship, when you can be in the most beautiful, grandest dining room, the Britannia restaurant, on 3 or almost 4 levels, because it has like an extra little step up top, with the grand staircase and the color-changing ceiling and the, all of the attributes of the golden age of ocean liner crossing. Why would you not want to be in that? And you can get that for $569. Per person. To me, it's a no-brainer. And even the Britannia Club, which is it's an upsell. The cabin is the same, but you're in a smaller dining room, and they claim that you get a more personal level of service. But again, if you're not a very nice person, you treat waiting staff like crap, and you're in Britannia Club, you're going to get worse service than being a nice passenger in the main Britannia dining room. So it goes both ways. And so all I'm saying is that the ship within a ship is fine for people who've got plenty of money and want to be segregated from the great unwashed. I happen to like people watching. I like being in a very special environment. And I mean, even on the Navigator of the Seas, the main dining room is stunning. Like, it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Enchantment was the same. Yeah. It looks like it was designed. My Fair Lady dining room is what they called it. But it had this gorgeous sort of twin staircase at the front. It had chandeliers. It looked like it was designed to look like Titanic-esque kind of dining room on a cruise ship. But the thing about the whole ship within a ship concept is, if it's done well, if it's done in such a way that you're not removing amenities from the great unwashed, as you said, like people like us, who are on the main part of the ship. That's one thing. But I think the thing that I guess irks me a little bit, and probably maybe others, I don't know, maybe I'm alone on this, is that if you've got this situation where more and more corporations and companies around the world are taking what used to be $10 worth of stuff and taking half of it away and saying, now that's a new tier, right? You're going to pay the same for less, and now you've got a new tier.
Well, Princess have been doing a lot of this recently, that you can't get free pizza anymore in their pizzeria that's right there in the Grand Plaza. Why would you do that? Pizza is so cheap.
Yeah. It's a strange... look, I mean... there's so many different examples, but not just in cruising. I think the thing is that you're finding it with airlines, you find it with streaming services, with shopping centers, with everything. And it gets to a point where it's like, enough's enough, right? If you want to do something different and have extra ways for people to spend money on your ships, let's try and be innovative. Do something interesting. Yeah. Like the era when they started to introduce things like, the adventure parks or the extra... short tours that used to be like really interesting. Panama, where you go off the ship and go and see it from off the ship, or do a helicopter ride or something like that. That's a great way to make extra revenue. But to say to people, for all of the history of this company, you've had this as part of the base rate, and then take that and put it somewhere else and say,
this is capitalism, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
All these companies now are public companies in the main. They have shareholders. They have to pay dividends. They claim that they lost so much money during the pandemic, and then a lot of them had a lot of ship construction on order, which costs $1 billion a ship. So it's a lot of investment. So I'm not trying to apologize on behalf of the cruise companies, but I just think it's down to us as passengers to be a little more discerning. And I'm not paying upcharge. I mean, there's only some things I'll pay for. So I'll pay for Wi-Fi, but I'll pay for one device, right?
Yes.
And like, for example, sometimes in the all-inclusive fare, and it's the same on Virgin Voyages, the all-inclusive fare invariably includes the cheap Wi-Fi, right? The slow Wi-Fi, which is unusable. So,
which they basically put a limiter on, because the Wi-Fi is coming to the ship at the same speed, right? Correct. It's coming from Starlink or whatever. So
don't ever think that if you're being given Wi-Fi that it's going to be good. You're going to have to pay to upgrade it anyway. So I just wait till there's a flash sale or a promotion, and then I get myself the Wi-Fi. And as I mentioned before, if you monitor that price and the price goes down because they have another flash sale and it's 50% instead of 35%, you just call the cruise line, or you can cancel it. You can literally cancel it on the app, get a refund, and then just book it at the cheaper price. You don't even have to call them. So
the other thing is, if you can't get access to a flash sale before you go, And if your itinerary starts off with multiple port calls,
Yes.
so say it's like from one port to another,
Yeah.
and then there's 3 days at sea towards the end,
Right.
you just wait until you've got out of mobile range
Yeah.
and then get the Wi-Fi for the last 3 days if you need it.
Right.
And generally the prices come down as the cruise goes on because of less time.
Very clever. So I think that it's for us to be to outsmart the cruise line. And then you could say the same thing about drinks packages and excursions. Now, I don't really drink much alcohol. I quite like a pina colada by the pool in true 80s cliche fashion. But we worked it out that you really have to drink between 12 and 15 alcoholic beverages a day for the drinks package to be worthwhile. But psychologically, some people are just like, well, if I'm having free drinks, then that is like my nirvana. But I don't think like that. I'm like, but they're not free. It is literally
They're not offering you a cruise
to buy them.
They're not offering you a cruise package because they're trying to be friendly.
No.
They're offering you a cruise package because they're going to make money out of it.
It's highly profitable. And here's another tip: is that for the drinks package people, if you're buying cocktails or spirits, they tend to use the cheapest ingredients they can. So they'll have the cheap booze that they will put in by default, unless you say, no, I don't want that. I mean, I'm not very good on spirits. Let's presume it's gin. I don't want that gin. I want that gin. And they'll be like, oh, okay. Or sometimes they give you a little upcharge.
Well, it's the same with whiskey. They'll give you like a Jameson as the standard.
Right.
But if you want to go and have like a single malt, you have to tell them.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to kind of police it yourself. But ultimately, it's very easy. Here's what I wanted to tell you. Now, when I first started my kind of new life of cruising, because, for years I'd done those Cunard maiden crossings, but I never really fancied the cruise industry so much. I didn't live that near a port. Now I live much nearer a port. So I saw the advert of my first ship of my recent cruising life, as in the last 5 years, was the Norwegian Bliss. And Norwegian were advertising online, and of course they say special sale ends in, and there was a countdown clock, and it said it ended in like less than 24 hours. And I didn't know that this countdown clock just restarts after 24 hours. I had no idea.
Oh, they just roll the sail over.
They just roll the sail over. It's all marketing. Like, there's no truth to this. So I was getting all overexcited and thinking, I've only got 24 hours to book. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I mean, they're so naive. And I ended up booking it. And then when it rolled over and I saw that the deal had got even better, I got the email address of the CEO and I wrote to them and I said, look, I'm not an experienced cruiser. I didn't know that you do these sales, but they're fake sales. They're not real. They're just designed to draw us in. And I feel a little deceived, to be honest, because you said it was ending tomorrow and now it's tomorrow and the sale is a different offering. And so I wrote to them to kind of let them know, and they very kindly kind of wrote back and offered me, I think they offered me like a 5-restaurant meal package, speciality dining package. But that just proves it's important to kind of reach out and actually communicate. And
absolutely.
So I'm about to go on the edge, and I've written to them and I've said, look, it's my anniversary and I just want you to know that I'm coming on board and I've saved up and this is a really special trip for me.
Yep.
I don't want to be just another Joe Schmo. I want them to know how important it is. So I think that this is the lesson for us, is that how we behave, how we communicate, not just with the cruise line, but with our servers or our cabin stewards, and just you'll have a better experience if you do the prep in advance, put the work in, it'll come back to you in spades.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, listen, we have to finish because, our hour is up, and, our first episode was long and we're desperate to keep to time this time, so we'll come and do it.
It's hard for us because we're so passionate.
We could literally, and I love the fact that we don't bring any notes. It's like, that's how,
I know,
the nerd alert really is going off. So listen, all the best to you, Chris. Don't forget to check out Chris's other videos here on the channel too, about all sorts of ships and all sorts of situations. You can learn so much. And then join us next week for another episode of the Expert Cruise Show, and we'll do it all over again.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.